invite you to open your Bibles to the Gospel of Mark, where we have been in a series called Discovering Jesus, and we're going to continue that today. Just by way of looking ahead, we're going to take about a 3 or 4 week break from our series in Mark, and we begin next week with our guest Michael Smalley, a focus on relationships and marriage and family for about 4 weeks, and then we'll pick it back up in Mark after that short mini-series there. So if you've been following along, it's been a great series as we've been working through Mark's Gospel, and we find ourselves today in Mark chapter 7 and verse 24 to 37, and I'm going to read from the New International Version, and just follow along as I read it. It should be up on the screen as well for you. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an evil spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. "First, let the children eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs." "Yes, Lord," she replied, "but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he told her, "For such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter." She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged him to place his hand on the man. And after he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up into heaven with a deep sigh and said to him, "Ephphatha," which means "be opened." At this, the man's ears were opened. His tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. And Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. "He has done everything well," they said. "He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." This morning, I'm going to speak to you for a few moments about He does everything well. He does all things well. Have you found that to be true about Jesus? That everything He does, not only His miracles were miracles of perfection, but everything that Jesus does, He does well. And as just to put in context, these two stories that we're going to look at today in the Gospel of Mark, if you can kind of think of the Gospel of Mark as 16 chapters. The first 8 chapters are really trying to answer the question, who is Jesus? Thus our series title, Discovering Jesus. Who is Jesus? And it reaches a climax with a response that Peter gives in chapter 8, which we're coming close to now that we're in chapter 7. In chapter 8, Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And so Mark is taking some time in the early part of his gospel to really communicate who Jesus is. But as we move on from chapter 8, as we get further on in this series, we'll find that another question is important, and that is, how can we approach Jesus? How can we relate to Him? How can we connect Him? Now that we know who He is, how do we approach Him? But Mark gives us a little preview about how to approach Jesus with these two stories. You know, people have all kinds of ideas about how to approach God, and there's a couple of common ones that a lot of people fall into one of these two categories. One is more of the ancient approach to God, an ancient idea, and that is that God is some big tyrant that is out to get us, and we have to do all the right things to appease Him and please Him. And that's how we approach God. Just do the right thing so God doesn't, punish us. That's more of an ancient view and approach to God. More of a modern approach to God is that God is just a spiritual force out there, and you can access Him at any time in any way, and for your own purposes, and He's just readily there, available for you to approach Him. These two stories give us a much clearer view on how to approach God than those two views. And the first story tells us how to approach God, and the second story tells us why we can approach Him that way. So that's where we're headed this morning. Let's take a look at the first story. In Mark 7, verse 24, we see that Jesus leaves that place. That place is the region of Galilee. It's in Judea. It is basically up to this point, Jesus has spent all of His time in Jewish provinces, speaking and ministering to the people of Israel. That's where he's focused all his energies and all his ministry. And it tells us, though, that Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. Tyre is about 40 miles northwest on the coast, and it's outside of Jewish territory and into now Gentile territory. So for the very first time, Jesus uniquely moves out of Jewish territory into Gentile territory. And it tells us the reason why he did. It's because his ministry was so successful in Galilee that everywhere he went, everywhere he showed up, a large crowd of people were there. And many times that was crushing and exhausting. And we see several times already in Mark where he tells us that Jesus tries to get away to a quiet place, either with his disciples or himself, for rest, reflection, respite. The crowds were so crushing. Well, Jesus leaves Jewish territory and intentionally goes to what the Jews would consider unclean territory, Gentile area, in Tyre and Sidon. In fact, it goes on to tell us that he went up to Tyre, and then 20 miles more north, he went to Sidon. And then later on in the story, it tells us that he crossed over the mountains of Lebanon, and he came all the way down and ended up in the Decapolis. And, just walking that would probably take weeks, let alone months. So Jesus is taking a big detour here, but it was intentional and out of his way. And it says here that he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, did not want anyone to know it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. His fame had spread even into that area. And then in verse 25 and 26, we see an incredible thing happen. It says, in fact, a woman, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an evil spirit, came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia, and she begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her. What astonishing boldness. I mean, almost bordering on rudeness. Jesus is trying to get away. He's booked a condo in Tyre, and she, uninvited, just barges right in and falls at his feet. She's breaking cultural, religious customs. She's just barging through all of those things. Why? Because she's incredibly desperate. Her daughter has been possessed by an unclean spirit, and she's concerned. In fact, it even says here that she begged. That word begged is in the present progressive, which means that it was like she didn't just beg once. She begged repeatedly, and each begging got stronger. In fact, a parallel passage to this story is in Matthew chapter 15. Matthew, as he often does, spends a little bit more time, inserts a few things that Mark doesn't include. And Matthew said that the disciples were so tired of her begging that they urged Jesus to send her away. Isn't that a common response? When someone is annoying us, we just say, Lord, just tell her to go home, get away. But Jesus, even though it wasn't convenient, it's not why he went to that house, he doesn't send her away. And we have this incredible response. Now, we might say, wow, that's a bold way to approach Jesus. Where did she get that boldness? Well, at first glance, I could say, I can kind of understand. I think you would understand as well where she would get her boldness because, there are, on the spectrum of things, there are people who are cowards, and there are people on the other end of the spectrum who are heroes, and everybody else is somewhere in between, except for a category that's totally separate from that whole thing altogether, and that's parents. This mama is desperate, right? We could all understand the boldness of a mom who's desperate for her child. It's like, I don't care if I don't have the religious credentials, that I shouldn't be approaching a rabbi. I'm a Gentile. I'm a woman. I was born in Syrophoenicia. That doesn't matter. I don't care about that. I know I shouldn't be doing this, but my daughter is possessed and she needs help. It reminds me of when I was younger and much younger, and in Little League baseball, okay? And you know all about those Little League parents, right? And my mom brought me to my Little League game, and she dropped me off early for, batting practice and fielding practice. and she told me I'll be back for the start of the game, but I need to go pick up some things at the store. So she drops me off. I go out. I'm not thinking anything. We're just having fielding practice. And in fielding practice, the coach will hit ground balls to all the infield, and he'll pop flies and, out to the outfield. And it was at that moment where he was hitting pop flies to the outfield in the warm-up that he didn't get it out to the outfield. He popped it straight up. I was playing third base. My friend Wes was playing first base. And he popped it straight up, and it was looking like it was going right into the middle of the infield. So we're both running really hard towards this ball. And we're not calling each other off. We're running really hard. We did not calculate for the small little bump called the mound. And we both hit that mound at the same time and tripped at the same time. And the ball came down, and neither of us caught it because we were tripping. And the ball came down, and in between my left collarbone and Wes's mouth, the ball was caught. And as we fell, the ball's there, and immediately, how many of you know blood gets a lot of attention in those situations? Immediately, because Wes had chomped down on his tongue and cut his tongue, there was, oh man, I didn't expect, an amen is sufficient. Ooh is, oh man, I'm getting you. All right, but anyway, He's bleeding, so he gets all the attention, and they realize, okay, we got to get this guy off. And actually, he actually left, went to the hospital, and I'm sitting there feeling, because I had broken my right collarbone before. I thought, I've broken my collarbone, and I felt the pain. It was the same pain, and I'm sitting there, and because Wes left, and we only had one other guy as a reserve, they needed me to stay in the game and play the game, so we had enough on our team so we wouldn't forfeit. Of course, I didn't want to forfeit either, but I was hurting. Well, in the meantime, game starts, and the coach says, Larry, obviously you can't play third base because you're only a one-arm guy. So I'm going to put you out in center field because in Little League, nobody hits it out to center field. Just stay way out there. Nobody will hit it to you, but we just need you to be the ninth player here so we don't forfeit. So I'm out there in center field. I got my glove on this hand. I'm like this. And wouldn't you know it, my mom drives up. And she sits in the stands. And I see my mom having a conversation with other moms. And I can just see this happening. I'm going, oh, please, Mom, don't make a scene. Don't make a scene. And Mom is just starting to talk a little bit more. And about that time, the batter hits it into center field. The ball is coming for me. I back up so I don't have to catch it with his hand. I don't care about losing the game. I'm just hurting. And the ball drops, and I just grab the ball, and I toss it over to the right fielder who's come over, and he throws it in. Well, as he's throwing it in, Mom doesn't care that the game is going on right now. And Mom makes a beeline from the stands right out into the game, and I'm going, oh, great, here comes Mom. And she grabs my one good hand, and she hauls me off of the field, right past the coach, glaring at him with, spiritual authority or something. And she puts me in the car, and she takes me to the hospital, emergency room, and sure enough, they took x-rays. I broke my collarbone. They put me in a sling. And I'm thinking, okay, good, I'll just go home. No, not my mama. She takes me right back to the game. She wants that coach to know, you put my son in center field with a broken collarbone, and I want you to see it's legit. And she took me back to the game. I mean, the desperate mothers, right? You got it. You can understand why this woman doesn't care. She doesn't care that she doesn't have the credentials to approach a rabbi. She's desperate for her child. And she breaks through. And then Jesus says something, and her second response, I think, is what is even more astounding than her boldness to approach Jesus. Jesus says something that at first glance is really, it's kind of hard to just wrap our minds around it. He says in verse 27, "First, let the children eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs." Now, at first glance and on the surface, this appears to be an insult, doesn't it? In fact, I dug a little deeper and I realized it is somewhat of an insult. It's not just appearing to be, because, you see, we live in a canine-loving society. Isn't that true? In fact, in Seattle, we live in a pet-worshiping society. I mean, I love pets. I'm all good, and I'm not going to go down that road because I don't want you to tune out the sermon here, but our society, we can't read our society into this story. When he calls this woman a dog, basically, that was not a good thing. That was not a pleasant thing. In fact, in Scripture, you look at other places in Scripture, how about the story of when Goliath and David were about ready to have a battle, and David is approaching as a small boy this big giant. And what does Goliath say? He says, "Am I a dog that you would come at me with sticks?" It was a very derogatory, insulting statement. Am I a dog? And what we have to understand here is that Jesus is really saying something here that is a parable. It's a really short parable. Let's look at it again. He says, "First, let the children eat all they want, for it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs." When Jesus used the word dogs, because in that culture, what they usually use the word for dogs would be those larger dogs that were kind of malnourished and would run the streets and be scavengers. Those of you who have went with me to Nicaragua, you can immediately picture. It's those dogs, okay? Those mangy-looking dogs just going around scavenging. But Jesus didn't use that word when he said, throw it to their dogs. Jesus used the word, a diminutive word here, that means, in our vernacular, puppies. Would be a household dog, one that you'd have in the house. And so he's telling a story here. He's saying to this woman, you know how it goes at the dinner table. When you have dinner, the children eat the food first, and then you give some to the puppies. But you don't reverse the order. You don't feed the puppies first, and then let the kids eat second. Every sane mom in the house is going, amen, Pastor. That's just the right order, right? And Jesus is giving this little story, and you would think that maybe it would push her back. But it's awesome to see that she sees in this little story that Jesus is giving her both a challenge and an offer. The challenge is, you're not a child. You don't get to sit at the table. And here's what's interesting. She accepts it. Look at verse 28. She says, yes, Lord. Isn't that amazing? A Gentile, Canaanite, non-Yahweh worshiping woman just is told that she's not a child at the table in the story, but she's more like a dog. And she says, yes, Lord. What is that telling us? She gets it. This is a one-verse parable, and she got it. There are larger parables that Jesus gives in the New Testament, and his disciples who are with him 24/7 don't get it. But she gets it. She realizes that it's true, that there is a proper order. In fact, in Matthew's account of this, he says, Jesus says this, I was sent to the lost sheep of Israel. Jesus is saying, my intention in coming to the earth physically as God in the flesh, my first order of business is to preach the gospel to the children at the table, and the children at the table are the Jews. Paul echoes it later, to the Jew first and then to the Gentile, right? It's not a matter of value, who's better or who's worse. It's a matter of order. He uses the word first. And so she gets it. She realizes, you're right. I don't have any right to be at the table. I'm not a Jew. I haven't received the Ten Commandments. I haven't, been part of the tribes of Israel. I'm not any of that. I agree. Yes, Lord. But she also sees in this little story an offer, not just a challenge. And she uses the three-letter word, but. Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. What's interesting is she is saying something about Jesus in her response. She's saying, it's right. I shouldn't be at the table, but even the dogs under the table get crumbs. What she's saying is, I know about you, and I know you're not a stingy God, that there's always more than enough that I can have mine too, and I want it now. Heal my daughter. Are you getting what she's responding? Here's the first key principle I want you to write down if you're taking notes today, and that is this: Jesus has more than enough grace for anyone and everyone to receive. There's always crumbs. There's always leftovers. There's always an overabundance when it comes to Jesus' grace. The gospel isn't exclusive to one, but there was an order, and the Jews were being presented the gospel and the kingdom first. And she says, yeah, but I want mine now because I know you've got some for me too. And see, some of us need to start praying that way. We need to start praying based on the fact that we know that we have a God who is more than enough. That's the word, El Shaddai, more than enough. A God who's more than enough. Some of us pray that God is a God who's not quite enough, and I'm being left out. Or a God who's just enough. But no, He's a God who's more than enough when it comes to grace. He has more than enough mercy. He has more than enough grace to meet you and to meet me in our time of need. That's the kind of God we have, and that's the kind of God she recognized in Jesus. Look just a page or so back in Mark chapter 6. Do you remember the story of the feeding of the 5,000? In Mark chapter 6, starting with verse 42, it says, after He had multiplied the bread and the fish, and they all ate, it says, they all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. And the number of the men who had eaten them was 5,000. What does that tell us? The disciples had a personal parable right in front of them, a personal illustration. When Jesus broke the bread, He only had 5 loaves and 2 fish, but He had more than enough for everyone to eat and be satisfied. And oh, by the way, there were 12 basketfuls left over. For the 12 disciples, He used to have a basket to remind them that Jesus isn't one who just, not quite enough to feed everybody or not just enough to feed everybody. He's got more than enough for everybody. Can we start praying like that? Can we start believing like that Jesus has more than enough grace for anyone and everyone to receive? This woman's faith is incredible here. Well, we see her kind of in a little bit of a wrestling match with Jesus, but she's doing it in a very respectful way. Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs under the children's table. It reminds me of Abraham. In Genesis 18, do you remember when God revealed to him that He was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? And Abraham, because of his love for his own family who was in that region, said, Lord, if there be 40, will you hold off in destroying? And the Lord says, there's this going back and forth, this interplay. God says, yes, if I find 40 righteous, I won't destroy. And then He goes, oh, Lord, if I be so bold to ask, how about 30? And it just works its way all the way down to 10. There's this back and forth, a little bit of a wrestling match. But Abraham, because he knows his God, he is interceding and he keeps asking just to see if God will respond. He doesn't give up the first time. Or how about Jacob, who was wrestling all his life with God and finally comes to a point where one night, literally Jesus comes in the flesh as an angel, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ took place in the Old Testament, and says that Jacob wrestled with this man, this angel, the Son of God. And he's wrestling at night, and he says to him, I will not let you go until you bless me. Wow. I see that in this woman here. She's going, yes, Lord, but you've got something for me, and I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. That's boldness. That's persistence. That's, as Jesus said in Matthew's account, behold, this woman has great faith. Faith that is above and beyond the normal expression of faith. It's difficult for us to really wrap our heads around this woman's assertiveness, because in our Western society, the assertiveness that we know of is an assertiveness based on our rights. We feel like things are owed to us and we have a right. And so we get assertive because we feel like we have rights. But this story is nothing like that. This story is rightless assertiveness. She had no rights to be there. She had no rights to be at the table, and yet she was assertive in approaching Jesus. So why did she come? Why did she come? Well, it comes to principle number 2, if you're writing this down. Principle number 2 is come to Jesus on the basis of his goodness, not yours. On the basis of his goodness. You see, she could be assertive and bold even though she didn't have any rights because she perceived that he was good and that he had more than enough. And when we come to God and when we come to Jesus, we don't come based on our goodness. I've got rights because of what I... No, we don't have any rights at all. What we deserve was death. But because of what Jesus has done, because of his goodness, we can come. We can approach with confidence, with boldness, with assertiveness, based on his goodness, not ours. So, what's the basis for this boldness? We're seeing how we should approach God. We can approach, and we're asked to approach with bold assertiveness, but with a humility and a rightless assertiveness, because we realize we don't deserve it on our own. What's the basis for it? And that brings us to our second story. Because right on the heels of this delivering of this girl with a demon, we have the second story of which Jesus interacts with a man who is called deaf-mute. He could not hear, and at the very least couldn't speak very well because of his deafness, but may very well was not able to talk at all. If at all, not very well. And what Jesus does in this story is very interesting. Did you think about that? When Jesus, what's all this about? Jesus comes, and it says that he takes the man aside, and he brings him over away from the crowd, and then Jesus touches his ears, and then he spits and touches the man's tongue. Now, right there, many of you say, oh, hygiene, ooh, where is the sanitizer? But he spits and then he touches. Spit in that culture was believed to have healing properties. But he spits in his hand, he touches the man's mouth, then he looks to heaven, and then it says he sighs deeply. And then he says, be opened. And immediately the man hears, and the man speaks clearly. What is all that about? Some would say, well, maybe it's, it's the rituals that the miracle worker and the healer go through. Kind of like baseball signs. Be opened. But how ridiculous is that, right? Because the previous story that we were just in, he didn't do any of that stuff. In fact, he wasn't even where the girl was. The woman had to go home and see that she was healed. Distance was there. He wasn't even in her presence. So it's not a ritual that Jesus went through. In fact, he wasn't needing to do that for him. He was needing to do that for the man. And that's what I want you to see here. Is that by touching his ears and touching his tongue, and looking up to heaven, what Jesus is communicating to this man. He's speaking to this man. He said, all right, I know you can't hear, we got that. And I know you can't speak, but I got that. And the reason I got that is because it's coming from somewhere that's not here. It's coming from above. You see what he's doing? Jesus is identifying with this man. He identifies with him at the very least cognitively. He is communicating through some sort of a sign language to this man that I know you're hurt, I know your brokenness, I know you can't hear, I know you can't speak, but I also know where your deliverance comes from. He's communicating at a cognitive level, but he's also communicating very emotionally. He's identifying with this man very emotionally because, notice, he pulled him away from the crowd. This shows us how compassionate and sensitive and caring Jesus was for the emotions of this man. Because can you imagine growing up not being able to hear and not being able to speak, and how you would have been felt as an outcast, ridiculed, shamed? The last thing this man needed emotionally was to be a spectacle, because he's been a spectacle all his life. And Jesus very compassionately and wisely pulls him aside. He's connecting emotionally with this man. I want you to write this third key principle down this morning, and that is Jesus identifies with your brokenness. You may be here today, and your problem is not that you can't hear or that you can't speak. But one thing's true about all of us, because we're human beings. We all have brokenness of some sort in our life. Sin has brought brokenness in our life. Some of you have broken relationships. Some of you are broken physically today. Some of you, there's all kinds of ways in which you're broken, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Here's the thing. Jesus is not out to make a spectacle of you, but Jesus wants to identify with you, and he wants to identify with your brokenness. In fact, he was so strong about identifying with our brokenness, he came into our broken world and felt the things that we feel, experience the things that we experience. In fact, turn with me, if you will, to Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. Hebrews 4, 14 to 16 says this: "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin." Then it tells us how we can approach a great priest like that who knows our brokenness. It says, "Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." But there's something deeper here. Jesus isn't just connecting on a cognitive level and an emotional level. Because it says, not only did he touch his ears, touch his tongue, look up to heaven, but then it says he sighed. And not just that he sighed, it says he had with a deep sigh. In fact, I looked at that word this week, and it says it literally means to moan, as if in pain. Wow. Why would Jesus moan as if in pain at this moment? Is it just because he's so identifying with this man's emotions that it's painful to him? Maybe. But here's the deal. Jesus knows he's going to heal him. If I was there and I knew I'm going to heal this guy, and I'm identifying with his emotions, that he's had all this shame and pain and brokenness in his life, if I wouldn't sigh a deep sigh of pain. I'd go, "Dude, I got you. In just a minute, it's going to be the best day of your life." That's the way I would approach it. Jesus does a deep sigh. He moans as if he's in pain. It clues us into the fact that Jesus is seeing not just this man in his brokenness. Jesus sees beyond, and he sees that in order for not only this man, but all of us here today to really receive healing for our brokenness, is that it's going to come at a cost. He recognized, I believe, at that moment, as he looked past this man towards the cross, that there was going to come a day where he would take stripes on his back, that he would take nails in his hands and feet, that he would take his beard being pulled out, his spit upon, and crown of thorns. And it says, by his stripes we are healed. See, Jesus knew that there was a cost, and he knew he was the one who would pay the cost. In fact, Mark gives us a real good clue in the original language. For the word deaf-mute, which was actually, for the phrase, I guess, or the two words deaf-mute, there was actually one Greek word. It's called mogalilon. And sounds like a Disney movie, right? Mogalilon. Mogalilon. You know what's interesting? It's not found anywhere else in the Greek New Testament, only there. And then in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew of the Old Testament, mogalilon is only used one other time. I think Mark, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, wanted us to see when Jesus was ministering and sighing deeply, about ready to heal this deaf mute, this mogalilon, he wanted us to see that connection. Let's go there. It's found in Isaiah 35. Isaiah 35. Verse 3, strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be open and the ears of the deaf, there's Mogalilon, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute, again, Mogalilon, the mute's tongue shout for joy. And water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. Mark is wanting us to see that the one who Isaiah prophesied years earlier, the one who would come to save us, you would know that the one who has come to save us is truly there when the blind see, and when the deaf hear, and when the lame leap for joy, and when the mute are able to speak. You know that the God who's come to save us is here. But there's something in Isaiah's prophecy that, I don't know, at first doesn't fit. It says he's going to come with vengeance and divine retribution. Is that the Jesus we're seeing in the Gospel of Mark? Is Jesus coming around and going whack, whack with a sword? Divine retribution and anger and punishing people. And is that the Jesus that we're seeing? No. But here's the key. Jesus didn't come to bring divine retribution. He came to bear divine retribution upon himself. And so when Jesus sighed deeply at that moment, he realized he was a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy that the Mogalilon, the deaf mute, yes, that he would be able to hear and to speak, but it was going to come at a cost, that he would have to bear divine retribution so that all could be saved, all could receive healing, all could receive hope, but it was at a cost of his life. That's the pain he was feeling at that moment. And so we see something that ties these two stories together. And that is, on the cross, because Jesus hung on the cross, and it says, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. They're outcast, they're thrown aside, they're treated as dogs. On the cross, the ultimate child of God, the Son of God, became a dog, so that we dogs could become sons and daughters with access to the very table of God. Amen. Friends, that's the gospel. That's the good news for us today. That, yeah, we might feel like we're an outsider. You might be sitting here today and you're saying, you know what, I don't know if I've got the qualifications to approach God today. I feel like I'm on the outside because I didn't grow up in church and I don't know all this language you guys use. When you talk about open communion, I think you're talking about practicing opening the communion. I don't get what you guys are talking about. I'm on the outside. If you knew my track record, if you knew I spent time in prison, or you knew if I was unfaithful to my spouse, you can go on and say, I have no credentials to approach God. Listen, none of us do. The only credentials we have to approach God is that the Son became a dog, so this dog could become a son. You can be children. It's based on His goodness and His grace. That's why we can approach with boldness, but a rightless approach. A rightless boldness. It's not self-righteousness. Listen, if this woman in the first story would have got all in a huff and said, how dare you call me a dog? And walked out. First of all, she never made the story in the Bible, right? We wouldn't be talking about her 2,000 years later. And see, so often we think we have every right to come to God sometimes in our own self-righteousness. And God says, that's like filthy rags. You come to that place where you have no rights other than what Jesus did on the cross for you. And if you accept what Jesus did on the cross for you, you have every right in the world to approach with confidence and ask God to give you mercy and grace to help you in your time of need. Let's close this up with a couple of application points. I'll try to make this very quick for you. Number one, here's an application point in these two stories that I want us to grab hold of today, and that is that only Jesus can truly break down racial and cultural barriers. So follow him. Follow him. You notice all the way back at the beginning of the story, Jesus intentionally and inconveniently went to the outcasts, went to the other side of the fence, went to those who were non-Jews. He crossed cultural, racial, and gender barriers. It was no problem for Jesus to do that, because they really didn't even exist for him. He crossed those barriers. And we need to, if we are in our society, in our day, in which racism and division and gender are all big issues today, as Pastor Steve has been encouraging us, we need to not just say, I'm not a racist, or not just say, I don't have, that stuff doesn't matter to me, I'm over that, I'm past that. No, we need to be like Jesus, right? We need to intentionally go to. We need to, even when it's inconvenient, I'd rather have a day's rest. We need to intentionally and even inconveniently cross those barriers like our Lord did. But lest you just kind of look at Jesus as some example of liberal tolerance, he's more than just an example to follow. He is the very one who can change your heart so that the seeds of racism and gender inequality are not even in your heart. Because when you accept the fact that the Son of God became a dog so that we dogs could become sons and daughters, it begins to melt away our self-righteousness, and it begins to remove anything that would say, you know what, I'm above anyone else. We realize there's more than enough for everyone to eat at the table. Amen? And that's the love that begins to well up in our hearts. Second application point, and I close with this. Only Jesus knows exactly what you need. Only Jesus knows exactly what you need. So trust him. You see, in both these stories right here, Jesus treated each individual very uniquely, didn't he? With the woman, kind of comes off as a little, harsh. Offers a challenge. It's kind of this interplay, this wrestling match. With the man who was deaf and mute, he's very compassionate, pulls him aside, very, very compassionate and gracious towards this man. Two different ways. Why is that? Jesus knew that woman needed her faith to be drawn out through that interplay. That's what she needed. And he also knew that that man needed someone to understand him and move into his world of brokenness and meet him at his point of need. You see, Jesus, as the people said, does everything well. He does everything well. Just to kind of build on that point a little bit, do you remember in John chapter 11, Jesus is delayed in coming to the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus because Lazarus is sick, and he actually intentionally delayed, it tells us earlier in the story. But by the time he got there to their place in Bethany, Lazarus had already died. And the first one he encounters as he approaches the house and the graveside is that he approaches Martha. And Martha says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother Lazarus would not have died. And how does Jesus respond to her? He actually takes her aside and rebukes her. Takes her aside and rebukes her. Lovingly, but rebukes her. And almost steps later, he encounters her sister, Mary. And Mary asks the very same question. Lord, if you had been here, my brother Lazarus would not have died. And I'm expecting Jesus the very same way to say, Mary. And he takes her aside and rebukes her. But he doesn't. What does he do? He stands there and weeps with her. What is that? I don't know about you, but if I'm Martha, I'm saying, how did she get weeping? I got gnashing of teeth. Jesus knew Martha needed that at that moment in that situation. and he knew Mary needed the weeping in her situation. And we ought to stop looking around and saying, okay, God's dealing with somebody that way. God knows exactly what you need. And he knows exactly how to give you what you need. And he knows exactly the right time to give you what you need. Joseph in the Old Testament in the city of Dothan was thrown into a pit, and he's crying out to God to deliver him from that pit, and God almost seems silent because a band of travelers comes and buys him into slavery. It seems as if God doesn't answer Joseph in Dothan. Many years later, the same city, Dothan, Elisha is facing a battle. He's got a young assistant with him, and the young assistant says, it's just you and I against this whole force. And Elisha says, praise to God that this young assistant's eyes would be open. And God opened his eyes to help him realize that there was a whole host of angels with chariots surrounding them. And God sent chariots and angels to deliver them in Dothan. Why does God not respond seemingly to Joseph's prayer in Dothan, but the very same city he sends deliverance? God knows exactly what you need at the time, and you have to trust him that he knows better than you do. And you have to trust him that he's got a better sense of timing than you and I do. But here's the deal. He does everything well with every person that approaches him boldly and with confidence. I'd like to invite you to stand, church. We're going to close our service a little differently because I sense that God may be stirring in your heart. You've come here today with a need. Maybe you've come and said, I feel broken and I just need to approach Jesus. I want you to approach him with boldness and confidence, not based on your merit, but based on the goodness of Jesus. Do you see that Jesus is here today, not with just, I just have 5 loaves and 2 fish. I don't have enough for everybody. No, Jesus is saying, I've got more than enough for everybody. If you'll come and you'll approach me with boldness, I will meet you. You'll find mercy and grace in your time of need.